It's an incredible pleasure to have you all here. As you may know, the World Employment Confederation-Europe is the European trade organization representing private employment services, which includes agency work, career guidance, and of course, recruitment. My name is Menno Bart, and I am the chair of the European Public Affairs Committee of WEC Europe. And in my day-to-day life, I am a senior public affairs manager at the Adecco Group. Today, we will discuss the fact that new technologies, including artificial intelligence, are changing economies and labor markets. In our view, for the better. They offer new job opportunities for Europeans and they enhance productivity. However, these new technologies also come with challenges as well as opportunities. And to reconcile these, the European Commission has recently proposed a European framework, including a regulation for responsible use of AI in the EU. Today's program will focus on AI's use on the labor market in general and in labor market matching, recruitment in particular. And to discuss that, we have a contribution by Kilian Gross of the European Commission, setting the scene for us, if you will. We have two best practices to share today with you, from the day-to-day life of to real-life examples of AI. And then we have a great expert panel with experts from Business Europe, Patrick Grant, from WEC Europe's Data Protection and AI Task Force, Wouter Bas van der Vecht, and Loco Morel, who is a professor of global ICT law at Tilburg University. While we are going through this event, you will all be muted and your camera will be off. However, if you want to join the discussion, you can do so in two ways. You can use the chat box for comments, for quick responses, for any contribution you want to make. If you have a specific question, we ask you to put those in the Q&A box. It's easier for us to direct questions to the relevant speakers, and speakers may also use that Q&A function to already reply to you using the chat function there. So please make sure to use the right option, either Q&A or chat. And then, of course, you're more than welcome to engage online, on social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it. We are happy to have you. Now, on that note, I am very happy to kick off and welcome the first speaker, Kilian Gross, Artificial Intelligence Policy Development and Coordination at the European Commission. Kilian, thank you very much for being here, and the scene is all yours.
Thanks a lot, Menno. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to have the chance to discuss a little bit with you and to present our most recent AI proposal. Because, as you may know, the EU is the first economic zone in the world where we have proposed now on the 21st of April a comprehensive legislation on AI. And this is, of course, a milestone for us, which will have as well important implications for the world of labor. And therefore, we are more than happy to share this with you. And I will try to take you quickly through some of the key elements we try to address in this regulation. In this draft regulation, I have to say, sorry. I hope you can now see my screen. Otherwise, please, Menno, give me a signal.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
The European Commission has adopted on the 21st of April an important package. And this package consisted of, beside a little chapeau communication, of two major elements. One was a coordinated plan on support of AI, because we think AI is a great tool which can really help us. And you see on the left-hand side some societal benefits of AI. So we speak here about, we see the autonomous driving, we see healthcare, very important under the COVID-19 crisis. We use AI, for instance, for developing of CT scans to discover COVID. For predictive maintenance in factories, for instance, as well, it can help to avoid repetitive work. So there is a lot of benefits on AI, but on the other hand, the EU and therefore we have a coordinated action with member states, and these actions are comprising more or less 40 actions of member states and the Commission, or both together, how we want to support the uptake of AI, and our target is to achieve more or less 20 billion of private public investment in the EU on AI every year until 2020. Within these actions, we have as well actions, of course, on skills, because we know that this is a very important area, reskilling, upskilling, so to prepare our labor market for these new challenges of AI. This is a very important element. We have this digital skills alliance, so we will work on this, and one part of the coordinated plan is clearly dedicated to this. On the other hand, of course, we are aware that AI comes with some risks and may create some problems. And we think that we need from the beginning to address these risks, not in order or in view of preventing the uptake of AI or the use of AI, on the contrary, in order to make it safe. So we want to create a legislative framework which makes it safe vis-à-vis fundamental rights or physical integrity to use AI, so that you can rely on AI made in Europe. So that's a bit what we consider to be the European way of doing this. The first question, of course, we had to address when we started our journey was, what is in reality AI and what do we want to cover with AI? And there's a lot of discussion about this, because there's a lot of different algorithmic decision-based systems, and not everything is considered to be AI. And the risks are different, because AI comes, and that's the reason why we go for this horizontal legislation, comes with certain risks, namely the lack of predictability, opaqueness, the difficulty to find out why a certain decision has been taken, or to document how a decision has been achieved, which all these phenomena are normally described as this black box phenomenon of artificial intelligence. We went, as you can see on the right-hand side, we based our definition on the OECD definition, which is the only definition which is internationally recognized. And we tried, and this is here what we say here, a software that is developed and so on. You see this here, the whole definition. But we tried to narrow this a little bit down by adding an annex where we give the technical approaches, which we consider to be AI, and there we are very concrete. So we put in machine learning, for instance, or symbolic reasoning. And this is to be in order to make it simple to apply the regulation, because the definition may leave some room of interpretation, but together with the annex, we think it's very operational. And the annex, on the other side, can be amended over time. So if there are further techniques which are used to achieve the same objectives and which display the same difficulties, then this should be covered by this regulation as well. In that respect, the regulation should be technology neutral. It should not discriminate one technique against another. All the techniques which belong to the family of AI should be covered and should be treated legally the same way. The key idea of this regulation is that we want to make it risk-based. So we don't want to treat everything the same way. We want to treat it according to the right level of risk. And in this, we believe that a lot of AI has no risk or very limited risk and doesn't really need a specific regulation. This is, for instance, the control of your spam on your inbox. This can be a tool to do predictive maintenance in the factory, and so on. And then there are certain, and this is probably the bulk of the AI, because this is the foundation of our pyramid. So these are the what we consider 80 to 85% of the applications. And then we have a yellow group here, which is AI with specific transparency obligations. This is AI which is not particularly risky as such, but where we think it is important that the user knows that he or she is confronted or dealing with an AI, like in the chatbot. You should know that you're speaking to a computer and not to a human interlocutor, and that is important, and that's why there should be an information requirement, but nothing more. You don't need to check the system as such, but you should inform. And then you have the core of the regulation, which is the minority of the AI applications, perhaps 10 to 15%. These are the high-risk cases. And here we come as well to the world of labor, because we have an important group there on employment and recruitment, but as well in products. And here we think you need an ex-ante certification, what we call an ex-ante conformity assessment, in order to make sure that the AI is fit for purpose, is up to the highest standard before it enters the market in Europe. And then on the very top, we have some in the red zone, some narrow but important cases where we think these uses we don't want to see in AI. So we prohibit certain uses of AI in Europe. And that's here at the top of the pyramid, like social scoring, that we just don't want to see. We don't prohibit the technology, but we prohibit certain uses of this technology. If you now move from
apologies, can I quickly interrupt you for,
yes.
for a second? First of all, to comment to the audience that if you have any questions about this very interesting content, do feel free to put them in the chat box. Kilian will have to leave at 1 o'clock, so don't wait too long. And the second thing is there is a gray box over the slides where your video view is. So if you could move that view out of the way, then we can all see the full slides rather than a block, black block. Yes. And
I can't.
now we still see it on the bottom.
I can't move this away, but I can minimize it perhaps. Like this, I think that's the best I can do.
Okay, great.
I don't see how I can get the rest out.
This is
that's
already
really
done.
great.
Thank
If you can move that little box to the bottom right-hand corner, then that would be all that we would need. You see now a box that says talking, Gabriela Correa, for instance. If you can shift that, then
Like this, I think that's all I can do.
perfect. Thank you, Mr. Gross.
Okay, so here we come, we do our little tour up to the top of this. We had this already. So we start here from the bottom. We start with the minimal or no risk cases. I mentioned that here you would have the only thing we offer in this regulation would be voluntary codes of conduct. So you may, operators may, industry associations, developers may want to go on a voluntary basis for further codes and to certify themselves, but this is left up to them. This is purely voluntarily. We would support that as long as it doesn't contradict our regulatory system, but it's not at all mandatory by no means. Then we would have this yellow group, which is specific risks. And here I mentioned already, you have this transparency obligation when you interact with an AI system. This is the chatbot, unless this is evident. The second case we identify is emotional recognition or biometric categorization. These are cases, for instance, you go to a shop and you're filmed and the data are used to discover your emotions, but for instance, you're happy with the product, that you should be informed thereof. And the third one is the applying to label to deep fakes. This appears necessary in particular because people should be able to trust, unless it's obvious, of course, from the content, what they see is real, unless this is obvious or unless otherwise it should be indicated. If you then go further down, if this works. Here we come now to the high risk category, where we see the need to check the system ex ante, to do an ex ante certification that the system is compliant with our requirements. And here we have two major groups. We have the first is the safety component of regulated products. Here we look at sectorial legislation, for instance, cars, drones, machinery, robots. Are these products already subject to high risk legislation because they're sectorial legislation and they must undergo a third-party conformity assessment? Then the AI system embedded in that device should as well undergo such an assessment. So we follow basically the risk assessment of the sectorial legislation and to integrate a dedicated AI assessment within the overall assessment of the product. And then this may be more important for you. We have a second group of the self-standing AI systems. And here we identify in Annex 3, for the other one with the product we have Annex 2. For the Annex 3, we identify 8 categories where we think there is evidence to believe that these use of AI in these areas may be high risk. And within these 8 categories, we have dedicated use cases which are then high risk. So not the whole category, only the use case. And here you find employment and worker management and access to self-employment. This is the point number 4 of Annex 3, and it's explained in recital 35 and 36. This is not entirely high risk, but we think as work relations are particularly relevant for workers because there are important decisions which are taken for them. We need to protect them and we need to inbuild some safeguards. So therefore we have specified, and there is quote the text, that high risk are AI systems intended to be used for recruitment or selection of natural persons, notably for advertising vacancies, screening or filtering applications, evaluating candidates in the course of interviews or tests. And second, AI intended to be used for making decisions on promotion and termination of work-related contractual relationships, for task allocation, and for monitoring and evaluating performance and behavior of persons in such relationships. So we have tried to be rather comprehensive on this because we think it is very important that if AI is used there, that it is up to the purpose. This should not mean it's prohibited, by no means, but it means, and it should not be done, on the contrary, but it should comply at the highest standards on accuracy and information and so on. I will come to that on the next, there was one slide. There we come to that on the next slide, the different requirements. So here you see now how this would work out in the course of the certification of a new system. If you're a developer and you start to develop your AI system, you would have first to identify whether what you do is AI. So you look at the definition and Annex 1. You second would need to check whether what you do is high risk according to Annex 2, if it's a product, or Annex 3, one of the use cases, if it's a self-standing AI system. So for instance, if you have an AI system which is used for promotion, decision on promotions, you are high risk. Then you have to undergo the conformity assessment. You have to set up a quality management scheme, and you would receive the CE label. And once you have the CE label, your product can be used and marketed freely on the internal market. What will we check in this exercise? And here you have already a short overview. These are the requirements which we have set up in the high-level group where we worked on for 2 years, and we had already a tool, the Altai tool, which we have piloted with 300 undertakings or 300 systems. And here you see there are 5 requirements. First is the quality of the data. The training, validation, testing data must be of high quality. You must ensure a sufficient documentation. You must ensure the sufficient degree of transparency and use information, inform the user. You must ensure human oversight that can be either built in the system or, in the case of recruitment, it can be implemented by the user via the instructions of use provided by the provider. And of course, the system must be robust, accurate, and cyber secure. So this is very important. We have tried to specify the requirements in the legal text, and we will, our idea is that we will provide further specifications via technical standards. So once the AI regulation is really up and running, operators should easily be able to identify which standards they need to comply with in order to get the certification which they need. Then last but not least, we have the prohibited practices. These are 4: subliminal manipulation, exploitation of children, both or mentally disabled persons. Both must lead to physical or psychological harm. The general purpose social scoring, I spoke about that, and the remote biometric identification in public spaces. As this was very controversial, I break it down on the next slide in a bit more detail, because what we prohibit is, in reality, we prohibit the real-time remote biometric identification, RBI, for law enforcement, so for the work of the police in publicly accessible spaces. Here we have 3 exceptions. The police may use biometric identification tools for the search of a victim of a crime, if there's a terroristic threat, or to find an offender of an offense which is listed in the European arrest warrant, so something very serious. All this must always be authorized by a judge or by an independent authority. And this means you cannot have a 24/7 use of the system. You can only use it punctually after you have a judicial authorization and for the reasons which are specified in the Act. In any case, and that is on the right-hand side, all remote biometric identification systems remain high risk. So you need always to undergo an ex-ante conformity assessment. You must make sure that they are of the highest possible quality. And here we have even added some requirements, namely you need to provide additional logging, and you have always a 4 eyes principle. That means if the system identifies the person before an action is taken, 2 natural persons must independently check the result. Of course, all this is on top of the data protection acquis, which already provides for rather strict rules on the use of and processing of biometric data. We didn't want to stifle innovation with this, therefore we have provided for the possibility to offer regulatory sandboxes, which should facilitate the development and the testing of the AI systems. We have provided for facilitated access to data for these companies using the regulatory sandboxes. And we have prepared certain support measures, in particular for startups and SMEs, namely reduced fees and priority access to these sandboxes and advice via the innovation hubs. We have finally, just to be very short on this, we have foreseen a surveillance mechanism The real application of this regulation should happen by national authorities. There should be notified bodies checking the systems and notifying authorities, supervising the notified bodies, and market surveillance authorities. Member states will be relatively free to choose which authorities should do that. For instance, in the labor sector, they could choose authorities active already in the labor market or employment sector. They could as well go for the data protection authority. That is up to the member state to decide. What we insist is that the authority chosen must be, of course, notified to us and must be equipped sufficiently staff-wise and financially. Every member state has to designate a supervisory authority, which will be presented in the artificial intelligence board on the left-hand side, which should be the European supervisory authority to ensure the consistency of the overall system. Here, the European Commission will act as a secretariat, so we will make sure that this board works well, and we may later on add an expert group to the system, in particular to help us updating the system by updating the different lists, for instance, on the high-risk cases or on the techniques of AI. So this was, in a very short way, a quick overview about the different elements of the regulation. I'm now very happy to take up your questions. I know that this is very important in the world of labor, but I think I try to illustrate that we really have thought about that when we prepared this act, and you can see that we have in a number of places specific provisions for this particular topic. Thanks a lot for your attention so far.
Thank you so much, Kilian. And this indeed, it was a high level and quick overview, but I still thought it was very extensive and very insightful. So many thanks for that. I have a few questions for you, and maybe the first question is just a clarifying question on your last slide, where you mentioned this expert group on the European level. Now, of course, we already have the high-level group on AI that did a lot of work previously. So could you elaborate on, are those the same groups, or what is the role of that high-level group going forward? What will that look like?
The high-level expert group was really important for us because they prepared over 2 years, and the social partners, I think, were present there. They prepared over 2 years the different requirements. They prepared recommendations for investment, but as well recommendations for trustworthy AI. And the result of this work is the Altai tool, a voluntary online tool to check trustworthiness of AI. This expert group has come to the end of their lifetime, so this does no longer exist. What we could imagine, but that's not foreseen in the regulation, is that later on we may set up a new expert group once we have a clear overview of how the regulation will finally look like after Parliament and Council have decided, in order to have an exchange with experts, but as well with the different players in society and in the economy, because we will need, of course, need some expertise to supervise the market. What are new developments on the market? What are new AI tools coming up? New problems, new risks? In order to keep our system up to speed. Because one important element is, of course, that we're here regulating a very innovative and fast-moving technology, and we need to be able to be agile. So we need to adapt our framework to this fast-moving technology, and at the same time, we have to make sure that we are very clear so that everybody knows what he or she has to do. And therefore, the expert group may help us then to update the different elements of this legal act, of course, within the legal framework, with the supervision of Council and Parliament.
Thank you very much. Another question is that I understand that yesterday in Parliament, European Commissioner for Jobs, Nicolas Schmid, said whenever it comes to recruitment, AI, bias in equals bias out. And I understand this raised some question marks among some stakeholders, because there might be potential actually for AI to actually reduce bias, even if it goes into an AI system, to reduce bias and to make sure that the outcome is still equitable. In your view, do you also see that possibility of actually using AI to reduce bias rather than only perpetuating existing bias?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is this old saying, a bit blunt, to say trash in, trash out. So if you have bad data which you put into a system, the system will be as bad as the data you put in. And that's why one of the requirements we have in our regulation is indeed about data quality, because we need unbiased data and we need to make sure that these data are as good as possible. At the same time, we know, of course, that perfect data does not really exist. So, and some people even believe that completely unbiased data do not exist. And we cannot forget, of course, that the world as it stands is certainly not perfect and not unbiased. So we think, indeed, if we get it right, I mean, the risk of AI in such a recruitment context is, of course, that you perpetuate discrimination from the past. So you take biased data and you don't invite people with a different skin, or you don't invite a female for a certain job because in the past only certain white men have received these invitations for these jobs. And we should not perpetuate this. This is very clear. So we need to be very vigilant. Now, but we can as well, of course, if we know this, we can train the AI and build in filters and safeguards in order to avoid this. And I think in the ideal case, we can even become better, because we can program the AI in a way that then the recruiter gets regularly as well different proposals. We can make sure that the features which have led to certain pre-selections in the past do not appear, so that they're not taken into account. And that is really what we think by design, so that if you know certain elements, you should only look at elements which are relevant for your choice and not elements which are irrelevant for your choice. This is an important feature. If the system does not take into account elements which are irrelevant for your choice, you already can avoid a certain level of discrimination. And you can, with certain safeguards, of course, try even to improve. So I think we should not be too scared. I mean, the technology comes with certain risks, but as well as certain opportunities as well in the recruitment sector. And it could, if we do it very well, it could even help to overcome certain discriminatory patterns from the past.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'm looking at the time and I want to move on, but not before I ask this last also rather factual question from Wouter Bas van der Vecht, chair of our Data Protection and AI Task Force, who asks, is the CE certification that you mentioned also applicable for internally developed and used AI?
Yes, indeed. It will be applicable for internally developed AI as well for AI which you buy on the market. The background is that we don't want here to discriminate. We don't want to have different treatment between big companies who may develop AI tools, for instance, by themselves for their recruitment purposes in your context, or which buy them off on the shelf. Because in both cases, you have an impact on the internal market. And if, for instance, the rules would be different, we would just push for internal development and we would have a kind of a circumvention of the rules. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that the triggering event, as is in internal market legislation, is either the AI system is put on the market or is put into use in the internal market. So if you internally developed a tool, an AI tool, and you can do that, you're not restricted by no means, but in the moment you start to use it and it produces effects, then you have to do the same ex ante certification as if you were to buy it on the market. There should be no difference in treatment if you buy off the shelf or if you develop yourself.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for this very extensive initial setting the scene for us. I invite you to do stick around, and maybe I'll get back to you after the panel discussion for a few questions if we manage to do that before you have to leave. Now, having said that, I want to move on to Glenn Cathy, who is the head of digital strategy at Randstad. And Glenn is going to give us a first taste of what AI use might look like in the recruitment space in our industry. Glenn, take it away.
All right, thank you. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, very good. So I'm Glenn Cathy. I work with Randstad in the Digital Factory. I'm currently the SVP of Digital Strategy Innovation, and very honored to be able to present this case to you today. I want to set the stage first by saying that Randstad's not alone, but we are a large company, and as a large company, we receive a lot of applicants on an annual basis. In some cases, this can be many millions of applicants. And on an individual job basis, sometimes we can receive in excess of 200 applicants per opening. And that actually led us to think, how can we do the best job possible in responding to as many of these individuals as possible, and also give them some some quick, easy, and transparent insight into what their status is. And we really wanted to tackle that whole black hole problem where people apply and they never hear back from an employer. You know, part of it has to do with volume in some cases. Part of it also has to do that we found that many people who apply to jobs actually don't meet the minimum requirements of the job they apply to. So just to be clear, the chatbot that we have developed is actually on the initial phase of the intake and pre-screening. This is verification of minimum requirements only. Think things like a minimum age or a driver's license or a required certification. And this is based on programming logic that's actually determined by a person. So it's human in the loop. It's not an AI decision. And we use this to accelerate the connection of qualified applicants with recruiters to provide greater transparency also to those who are not qualified, essentially trying to eliminate that black hole experience. And that's why we decided to move in this direction, because the first question was, how do we respond to 100% of the high volume of applicants we receive to our jobs? And we also want to provide an excellent experience on a mobile device, because anywhere from 50% or a little more than 50% of people are actually applying on a mobile device, and filling out your typical employment application, job application forms on a mobile device is actually very difficult. So while we have actually worked with some commercially available chatbot solutions, we actually decided to build our own as well. So it is that initial phase of intake, as well as the ability to allow people to perform self-scheduling of interviews if they actually do meet those minimum requirements. Just wanted to show you a couple of animations quickly to show you what it actually looks like. It's one thing to talk about a concept, it's another to actually have a look. In this case, what you're seeing is what we would consider to be a human forward design on the left. We consider it low friction. If people want to, they can just hit quick replies. So we don't even have to try to interpret a result if it's natural language. So easy selection, and people can also switch or automatically switch languages as they enter into the chat experience. As I mentioned before, if someone actually answers the questions and they confirm that they meet the minimum requirements, they will be offered the opportunity to self-schedule in the apply experience to speak with the recruiter about that particular position. And on the right, I'm just demonstrating the fact that we can take quick replies, which are very easy. On a mobile device, it's much easier to just click a selection, of which there needs to be no interpretation of the response. Or if they want, they can provide a free text input. Now, some of the foundational elements of the solution when we set out to design it have also happened to align with our AI principles. Human forward, we're actually looking to make sure from the very beginning that this screening and scheduling solution actually benefits talent and clients at scale. There's always human oversight. In this case, there is a human in the loop. The decisions are actually predetermined by people, so there is no automated decision making. There is transparency that's clearly identified as a bot. It's also convenient because at any time a person can simply request that they would like to speak to a person, and they will have that option. So they're not stuck in a chatbot, in a chat experience if they don't want to be. It's definitely fair and inclusive with regard to the data we collect and the training data we use. And it's also private and secure. So I want to be very clear. I know I opened up by saying that decisions are not made by AI. So you might be asking, well, where is the artificial intelligence in the solution? In our solution, AI is used to interpret people's responses, especially the free text responses. So this is limited to natural language understanding and processing. And I won't read through the slide. Actually, one of our lead data scientists helped me with the information here. So I just wanted to give you some insight. So if people respond in a free text format, we're able to use AI to understand what they're saying, and we can classify it properly. Again, to be very clear, the solution is not on an autopilot. We actually have humans that are looking at hundreds of conversations on a weekly basis to gather insights to make it even smarter. In the beginning, it's no exaggeration that even in English, I think we determined there's over 50 ways of saying yes or no. So it's easier if we can have them hit a quick reply, just choose yes or no, but we're also prepared to be able to interpret a wide variety of responses that mean the same thing. As I was saying before, actual decisions are not actually made by AI. The decisions are actually made by people when they create the job in the first place. So if they set that there is a driver's license that is required because let's say it's a driving job, that is a minimum requirement that a recruiter is actually setting when they create the job. So the only thing that's actually happening in an automated fashion in terms of a decision, and I would even argue it's not a decision, is the execution of the logic that the human is actually determined from the very beginning. Also, we're not storing this information for very long at all, but it is also fully auditable. So we actually feel pretty confident in how this solution, we could actually deploy it, we feel today in Europe with the proposed regulations. We did start this project in the US about a year to 2 years ago, but even from day one, it was designed from the beginning to be able to be deployed globally. And we knew that there were probably going to be evolving regulations, so we were prepared for that. So the impact. So we want to make sure that it's clear that the chatbot is something, and the scheduling portion is something that actually has a benefit to all the people that are involved that touch this solution. So just to give you a sense of scale, so far we've had over 1 million conversations. We have close to 4,000 a month. We have a very high completion rate of the chats, which is a good indication for us. And we've scheduled almost 500,000 interviews as a result of using this solution. What's also of note is that we're actually increasing the number of interviews that we're having with people. So it's something I tried to touch upon early, is that we're trying to accelerate the connection between talent and opportunity. And this is clearly doing that. You might wonder, how happy are people with this solution? Very happy in terms of the satisfaction rating we're getting. And it's actually been an increase over the legacy non-chatbot and scheduling process. Also, some of the most important data is actually on this slide. It's the fact that we're able to schedule the majority of people, connect people to recruiters within 72 hours. And almost a quarter of those people are actually connected the exact same day that they apply to a position and go through this experience. This allows us in turn to be faster at presenting talent to our clients. We're trying to accelerate people getting work, essentially. And one of the, we didn't know this was going to happen, but we have actually shown that people who go through this particular process actually end up working longer in their assignments. There's a quality element that comes from going through this process, which we find to be very beneficial for all parties involved. Employers have people that work on their assignments longer, and people are actually working longer. Just to share a quote from one of our global services companies. They said, going through these immediate matches, and we're essentially filling our jobs faster, improving quality. So this is helping, high quality workers get to the opportunities that they need, and employers are able to find the talent they need faster than before. And again, actually retaining those people longer than before. I just wanted to share a couple of key takeaways, because of just closing out my portion of the presentation. I'd be able to take some questions if we have time. We showed you some of the metrics around how satisfied people are with going through the chat experience and the scheduling experience. But we've also found it interesting that some people end up chatting for 20 minutes or more. And that's because if they want, they are able to also provide some information around their preferences, which goes into the second point that I wanted to make, is that this is a very good way of capturing preference data. So that if somebody tells us they would prefer to work a third shift, or they want to make at least a certain compensation per hour, or there's certain location things that they have preferences for, gathering this data directly from the job seeker allows us to then provide them with a hyper-personalized experience and ensuring that they're getting the types of opportunities that they've expressed direct interest in. We've also learned that conversation design is absolutely critical. That's been an interesting journey, but it's something we feel like we've tackled very well. especially something called conversational divergence, where somebody gets several questions into the chat and then they want to go back and clarify a response or change their answer. Or even when people respond in a way that we can't interpret, we don't get them stuck in a loop. In fact, we can actually very quickly move on, and it doesn't actually harm them in the process. It's just simply something that we can move on. So they don't get stuck in an endless loop like some chat solutions put people into. So that closes out my quick little presentation overview of our application of AI chat and interview scheduling. Wanted to see if we had some time for questions. Also happy to answer them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom.
Absolutely, Glenn, and thanks so much. I mean, this is brilliant. This is really a real-life example of how we are all improving the service delivery to both job seekers and to clients, I would say. And indeed, I do invite the audience to use the Q&A box to ask any questions you might have to Glenn or to Kilian or to any of the upcoming speakers. Meanwhile, Glenn, let me ask you, I mean, we've just heard from the Commission sort of a detailed explanation of what the proposal is right now. In your view, do you see any impact on the way that you are using AI right now? Do you see this might fall under the remit of this proposal for now?
Well, I can't say that we were predicting the future when we designed this, but overall, we are taking a look at an overall principle of saying simpler can be better. There are certain applications of AI like deep learning that do not lend themselves very well to transparency or explainability. And so we are looking for scenarios like this that are a little bit more straightforward, that are very easy to provide high level transparency and explainability. We also, human in the loop element is a huge thing for us. We are essentially human forward in terms of our brand promise. We want to always have that mix of tech and touch. And so hopefully you can see in what we're talking about with this solution is that we're just trying to accelerate the connection of people. So this is an assistive technology. I don't feel like what we're looking at with this particular solution is hindered at all by the regulations, but we've already begun probably a year ago to think, where do we think we're going? Where do we think regulations are going? And how can we make intelligent choices around the use of AI to make sure that it will not be difficult for us to comply with the regulations?
No, that makes absolute sense. And we've just heard Kilian mention that not entire categories will be classed as high or low risk, but certain use cases. So in your view, maybe this should not be considered a high risk area, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, this particular application, especially when you look at the criteria, the fact that the decision is actually decided up front by the recruiter to say that this is a minimum requirement. They have to be a certain age. They have to have the certification. Is something we verify with the employer. That's, I would argue that is not an automated decision. That's logic that is simply executed based on the human's decision. So in this case, I would say that's actually no risk, because it's literally replicating what a person would do if somebody walked into a branch and we asked them, do you have, a forklift certification? They say no. Well, they don't meet the minimum qualifications of the role.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty straightforward in this case, we think.
I just see another question coming in. Someone asking, are there other fields or processes in which Randstad will put AI to use in the recruitment process?
For sure. I mean, there's a couple of areas within HR, like matching. So search and match. Artificial intelligence has been used for quite a long time to assist in search and match. So for example, a recruiter is looking for a software engineer and they only put in a title and maybe one term. AI has been actually used for well over 10 years to assist with that. So user puts in one term and then AI has already figured out, well, a software engineer is equivalent to a programming analyst and a developer. So it actually ends up making it a more inclusive search. You're actually pulling in more people. So it's, again, an assistive technology that actually makes the human's query more inclusive. It actually pulls more people into the funnel than if they just use that one particular keyword, which might filter out people who are qualified, but just don't happen to say the exact word that the individual used. So I would say search and match is definitely another area that's already being used globally with regard to AI, but there's varying levels of AI, and there's very simple approaches. The least dangerous, low risk would be just building out those synonym libraries that are assistive and expand a user search to be more inclusive. You know, certain applications of deep learning might be, they could be problematic depending on how they apply. There's a lot of variables. And if there is or is not the ability to understand how it's working, you know, if there's a lack of transparency and explainability, that's a problem. But that's something we're going to avoid altogether.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Glenn, for this overview and for your answering the questions. And with that, I want to move to our panel of experts. And it's an absolute pleasure for me to have with us today Patrick Grant, who is a senior advisor for digital economy at Business Europe. Wouter Bas van der Vecht, who is the Global Data Protection Officer at Randstad, but also the chair of the WEC Europe Data Protection and AI Task Force. And Locke Morel, a professor of global ICT law with the University of Tilburg, as well as a senior counsel with Morrison Foerster. Welcome, everybody. And I want to start with Patrick. I'll give you the floor to give a quick introduction, and then we can. I might have some questions for you.
Okay, thanks very much, Menno. And thanks very much for WEC for allowing Business Europe to be here today. It's obviously a crucial topic, AI, not just because the regulation has come out, of course, but AI is clearly a key enabler of economic growth for Europe, particularly in a moment when we are looking for as many key enablers for growth as possible to recover from this pandemic. It's also something that's going to develop and improve our societies as well, particularly as technology becomes much closer to us as humans. So it will improve the way that we work and the amount of time that we potentially spend at work as well, and free us up to do things maybe that we, you know, where we can be more productive, or also just have some more free time and enjoyable moments. In terms of, you know, solutions to challenges as well for Europe, AI is obviously something that's going to propel us to answer things like climate change, but also issues to do with healthcare. At the moment, throughout the pandemic, AI has been actually used by governments quite a lot to kind of model certain policy responses to how they're overcoming the pandemic with lockdowns and things like this. So it's been a tool to use to kind of test how well policy is working, but also look to the future. And I think that's really important to mention as well. And the final thing I just say in the introduction is we are in a global race to lead in AI as Europe. And we need to find a third way against the United States and China. And I think the Commission can be commended for bringing out this AI regulation and to try and find this third way where they're sort of clearly aiming for trust in AIs. That would be sort of the key message from European AI, I believe, through this regulation. But Business Europe believes that this trust needs to be achieved with excellence in mind as well. We are in this global competition and this race, and we need to lead in it. So obviously we need to be able to give our industries the tools to achieve, you know, sort of the best quality AI for societies. But as I said, the Commission, on the face of it, has done a good job. We're still assessing the proposal. In terms of consultation before the proposal came out, I think we would like to send a positive message to the Commission as well. They use this high-level task force on AI, and that has clearly fed into the way the proposal looks now, which I think we should just take a moment to say to the Commission in terms of better regulation. In the digital world, at least, which is what I deal with at Business Europe, this AI regulation seems to have been constructed in a very positive way. However, of course, the devil is in the details, so we do have some messages to pass today on the face of it. And the first I will just begin with is scope. The way that we see the proposal written right now in terms of how we define AI and how we define high risk is very broad. And this could have some damage in terms of legal uncertainty, bureaucracy for companies, but also just stop people investing in AI in Europe if we essentially make this high risk, this first step in AI regulation in the world, to be so broad that we're touching elements of AI that perhaps don't actually throw up many societal concerns. And if I could just go back to actually the Commission's presentation, there was a slide that essentially said, we would like to cover technologies not yet known or developed. Now, to us, that seems to be potentially looking at sort of science fiction and maybe trying to imagine the risks of AI, which I don't think is something that policymakers should be doing. Also, how far in the future are we looking when we pass those sort of comments? Are we looking 5 years, 10 years time, 20 years time? I mean, listening to the last speaker from Randstad, we can see how the technology itself, the humans involved, the human oversight in deploying that technology has really overcome potential societal concerns. So as AI is kind of an early technological area that is developing, we should also take into account the fact that as it develops, it also has the ability to not just create challenges and opportunities, but actually overcome these challenges to society. And I think, as we go through the co-legislative process, we should remember that. In terms of the actual detail of the legislation itself, Annex 3, for example, extremely broad on employment. The way we read it, at least, is it essentially says any AI that's used in employment, so not just recruitment, but just general AI use in the course of employment, would be high risk. So there we are covering many, many applications of AI. The white paper from the Commission last year, actually we felt was more positive in this area. It sort of said, it did this kind of two-step test that basically focused on the actual application of AI and risk at hand and the potential material risk to the consumer or the worker. And then sort of made a decision instead of this one size fits all saying, okay, everything in employment is covered by high risk AI. And there was an example given as well in that white paper that was pretty useful in demonstrating this. And it essentially said, if you have like an intrusive medical device with an AI element to it that's going into your body, this has a potential material risk. So this is high risk AI. But then it gave another example that said a doctor simply using an AI application to make appointments with its patients wouldn't be high risk AI. However, this AI is used in the course of employment. So is those kind of scheduling AI things going to be covered? Cautiously at the moment, we're reading that yes, potentially they are, but I would like to hear from the Commission if kind of picking off that low hanging fruit is their aim. Obviously for us, we want to keep with the intentions of high risk AI. In terms of Annex 2 as well, we're a bit concerned about the keen focus on industrial AI applications, which probably don't throw up as many societal concerns as maybe in the consumer area. Europe is leading in business-to-business robotics, for example, and we want to continue to do so. So I think we need to be careful about setting legislation on these sort of harmonized areas like machinery, medical devices, all this type of stuff that has a lot of legislation already and is actually also being updated for new technologies anyway. We want to obviously make sure there's no contradictions between this broad AI regulation and those harmonized pieces of legislation, but also no overlaps as well. In terms of the actual market access requirements, we're pretty positive overall. I mean, we're still going into the details, but they seem pretty reasonable, particularly things around transparency with AI. Obviously, that's very important to achieve trust across Europe. For new technologies, things like record keeping as well. This is a practice that's already done and we believe could be done also in AI as well. However, where we have some concerns surround some of the details of the requirements, the fact that they sort of tell AI producers to like how they should achieve the goals. So, for us, regulation policymakers should set out the broad policy goals, compliance goals that businesses need to adhere to, but they shouldn't necessarily tell businesses exactly you need to follow A, B, C to achieve them. I think the creativity and the know-how of industry is probably more forthcoming than policymakers in terms of how to achieve some of the goals that they're setting. So an example of this is to do with data sets. So while ensuring training and validation of data sets should definitely be included as a compliance requirement for businesses to ensure we go through the process of making that happen, writing things down saying basically those data sets, by the way, need to be free of errors might be something that is impossible and not even actually wanted by engineers or AI because of the sort of results that it could throw up. We're positive on the fact that the AI regulation will permit self-assessment for conformity. Obviously, this lowers costs. It gives the manufacturer who has the know-how to check compliance itself, and then obviously it doesn't mean that they're not potentially open to a market assessment later on. But in the process of bringing a product to the market, this makes it very efficient. We don't have bottlenecks with certification houses, for example. So again, for Europe to sort of lead in AI and not sort of slow down the rollout of new things coming to market, we think it's very good to keep that self-assessment in there as well. And just final points. Yeah, sorry.
No, indeed. Final points, indeed. If you're wrapping up, great.
I will finish. Final points are there's a lot of delegated acts in the proposal. So if you're going to allow the Commission to change overnight what sort of AI is high risk, obviously this is going to impact investment for business. We need to know what's happening in the future. I think the high-level group on AI should have been put in the proposal to potentially aid that, at least to aid communication to industry about what's happening. Otherwise, my final message is just basically to say, let's keep trust with excellence in mind. And also policymakers should also keep in mind the impact of not allowing AI to come to market and what that could mean for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And indeed, this has been a very comprehensive overview. I have a few questions, but actually I'll also in the interest of time, I'll rather move on to the other panelists first. And Wouter Bos, having heard all this, what is your response also from a WEC task force perspective?
Yeah, so maybe put it first in a context, yeah, like Patrick also said, we really applaud that the European Commission is so proactive in getting a standard in Europe, which will be a starting point for also getting more global standards. If we look at the WEC, we represent all the private employment services industry, and in Europe, if we talk about touching the lives of 10 million people a year, and our ambition and our focus is actually getting people ready for their first and the next jobs as quickly as possible, and make sure that we can help them upskill and give them career guidance. And for that's also very important for our European economics, because that makes sure that we have a workforce that is able actually also to meet European economic needs for today and for tomorrow. We see that there is a lot of people needed with the right skills for all kind of jobs that are there and are coming. And to facilitate that, we really need technology to make that work. And actually, I think the example Glenn shared shows the importance of using technology to remove that risk of black holes and people not being responded to. And that's also a benefit for society as well, for our economic needs. As such, actually AI or any other tools will really be important also to make sure that we improve our labor market inclusiveness. And what you see is that non-discrimination principle really is grounded in the WEC Industry Code of Conduct. And from that perspective, what we did is we put in our Code of Conduct that principle, but also actually across the industry, we have controls implemented, like training of recruitment staff, run awareness campaigns, do undercover job applications. And all of this is actually done to make sure that we protect our workers against labor market discrimination. And this is, without looking at AI, this is already what we do. And we see AI as actually an enabler to contribute to that. And therefore, we also really welcome, like I said, this initiative from the European Commission, and it will really help create clarity in a level playing field. And we really see that this will have an impact even outside of Europe, because yeah, this is how these things work. We have seen that with the GDPR. We will see that now with this happening as well. But in this context, we really also agree with the risk-based approach of the use of AI for certain applications. However, we also have some concerns there, but I will come to later to that. If I look at it, it will help us increase labor market inclusiveness potentially, and actually also help sustainable labor market matches. But and that's a comment made already earlier in this discussion. There is a very high risk on bias. We all know with the type of data, the historic data we have. However, we see really an opportunity here, and that's what we want to really emphasize. Bias in is not per se bias out. It is potentially even quite the opposite. When governed and trained appropriately, AI can help identify human bias and ensure that these are minimized in recruitment. And as such, AI is a tool. A tool can be used for the good as well for the bad. And we as an industry stand ready to use it for the good, a better functioning, more inclusive labor market. And a predictable and clear European standard will definitely help us do so. However, I said there is some improvements we identify to help also deliver that clarity and predictability. For us, one of the issues we identify, and that relates also a bit to what Patrick mentioned before, is the definition of AI and what is high risk. Currently, it is actually so broad, the definition, and will introduce so many very extensive requirements and oversights to software that it might not even help managing the risks the Commission seeks to mitigate. So if we look at our own market, actually, if you look at the current decision, it feels like most recruitment software would be included, even things like the chatbot just shown, but also very simple Boolean yes, no things that are not that high risk. So to give an example, a simple web form where a registrant will have to enter an education or other hard elements like minimum age, driver's license, that would already be covered under the current definition. And I'm not sure if that's the objective the European Commission had in mind when drafting this proposal. Secondly, we really welcome the oversight that is in the decentral manner it's set up. However, we also see a risk that if you look at how it's set up, it might impact firms that work across different jurisdictions. And from that end, we would like to really have some more clarity on the oversight bodies and how that is organized within national jurisdictions, so that there is a form of alignment. So maybe making the link to the GDPR there again, it's very clear that all the data protection authorities in Europe are responsible for oversight in the national jurisdictions. Currently, in the current proposal, it's not that clear, and it's left open to the nations to decide themselves who should manage that. If you then work cross jurisdictions, how do you ensure that you don't get into clashes or different opinions by local oversight bodies? If we can therefore formulate these elements more specific, also in light of the very good risk-based approach set up by the European Commission, this would really help us to contribute to a more clear and predictable framework and help spur the innovation and adoption of AI. Yeah, so that's high level. I mean, you said you might have some questions, so happy to respond to those as well, Menno.
Thank you very much, Wouter Bos, and indeed we'll get there. But first, Loke, I want to move to you. And I heard Wouter Bos say that he's not sure that the current proposal will actually address the issues that the Commission is trying to mitigate. Do you share that concern, or what is your view on this proposal?
Yeah, well, hi all. I'm happy to be here. I have 4 takeaways reading the proposal. And first, I think there's a justification for the AI regulation above or on top of the GDPR. And I assume, and if Killian is still there later on, I would love to hear, I take this as a top-on of GDPR, rightfully focusing on high risk. For that reason, so it is, you could do your data protection impact assessment and then add on, if it's AI driven in a high risk, to add on the other requirements, because many overlap and it would be difficult to do both. So 1, I think there are benefits, and I'll discuss the 4 topics I'm giving now in a bit more depth later after. 1, benefits. But that being said, it focuses on high risk, but I think there's not yet the right balance. For me, it at the same time over-regulates, and in some other areas under-regulates, which results in different regimes and a clash with GDPR. I'll explain later. So that's the second. And then, having worked now for a long time GDPR, I feel that we didn't learn enough lessons from GDPR. The first is, and I had a bit of a deja vu, before GDPR, we had a mix of ex-ante requirements and accountability, and with GDPR, we really moved to accountability. And now with the AI regulation, we have again a mix, and I wonder whether that is a good idea. And the second part is working with all the big tech companies and large firms across the globe. A thing I missed when GDPR was enacted was that it could be a competitive advantage for large companies. I tell you, it is a major competitive advantage for large companies. Reading the AI regulation, I think that equally applies to the AI regulation. And I see a sandbox, and I see Killian giving some examples where small companies are helped. But I think that we really have to move that to a next level, because otherwise we are going to miss out. You can regulate, we are in an AI race, and the Commission feels that regulation is actually a benefit. GDPR is well looked upon as a success story, but I've also seen the downsides of that. And my line is always, we can regulate, but a referee never wins the match. We really need to take care of our business here to be able to counter the benefits of this type of regulation for the big players. So what are the benefits? Is there a reason for this regulation over GDPR? And I'm not going to explain what GDPR regulates, but I tell you, it well covers already a lot of the issues with data for training of AI and when you apply AI. But the point is, GDPR applies to the controller, which is processing the data in use. And they may involve a company to train AI for them, and then they claim that they are a processor. So the complaints of especially the CIOs in the big companies here in Europe, the controllers, say, look, we have all the risks under GDPR, while we're dependent on AI and software of third parties, should the requirements not be on the providers? And here we have their call answered. The AI regulation applies to the providers, and that from a regulatory perspective is far more efficient if you apply the rules directly to the parties developing the AI. Rather than having to go after each and every user using the AI. So the second benefit I really see is that GDPR gives a lot of open norms, and applying GDPR in a big AI project with people who are not yet or starting up on their AI journey, it's very hard to explain why all these requirements follow from GDPR. So I think it's great that there's an effort made to write them down, what controls and risk management tools are that should be applied to make this work. I welcome some red tape of what is not allowed, but that because GDPR doesn't give that. So again, the rightful focus is on high risk, so you can match that up with GDPR. And I see that the whole risk management in the AI regulation is quite heavy-handed, and I tell you, having worked on very high risk projects, these requirements then are very valid. So I'm not doing, and I recognize them. We thought them up working on these projects. So no surprises there. And I also like some clarifications on hot button issues. Can you use sensitive data for verifying basis? Bias, I would say, and I argued many times, yes, under controls, etc. I like what type of human oversight. I think that should be somebody really knowledgeable about AI and not, for instance, a recruiter checking a short list, because then there's not enough human oversight, which is the trend now on the GDPR. So all very good things. That being said, I think there's not the right balance yet. I don't mind the extreme definition of AI. It's the same as GDPR. Everything qualifies as personal data. I always call it compare it with Hotel California. It's easy to check in and you never get out. That is not a problem as long as it is very clear what high risk is. And then I think we don't have a fair level playing field again over and under regulation, which will give a clash. Because if you under-regulate, GDPR fully kicks in, giving nearly the same regime as the AI regulation, while the AI regulation is not in place, for instance. So, over-regulation, it's been said, but it is used, AI system used for recruitment or selection, and then it says notably for advertising vacancies. Advertising vacancies is very broad, and it gives as an example, then you think, well, anything a chatbot would fully apply, fit in this category as well. Though I do understand the examples mentioned, but they're too generic. It is not limitative. And I think it should apply to anything used in the recruitment context, which could well be advertising vacancies on job boards that are steered with algorithms and never reach certain people. So good example, but that have a high risk of negative impact on individuals and society, not just individuals. And I think many, having worked in this sector on all types of solutions, many recruitment systems or used in the recruitment systems are not high risk at all. I mean, you have many neutral tools or even tools that are positive. The chatbot discussed by Glenn is neutral. But also tools are very positive. I mean, I've seen AI tools screening job descriptions, highlighting whether they use inclusive language. I see chatbots that are used to ask for missing skills because certain women and minority candidates may not use the same language, and they just prompt, do you not also do this? Do you also not, They match with peer-based skills. Finding bias in performance feedback language, finding bias in performance scoring. I can go on and on. Flagging bias in promotions, in salaries. I tell you, these elements do not require the high, heavy-handed controls we discussed, which I find totally justified in any tool that can create bias, but not the ones that actually try to improve that without having any impact, negative impact on access to jobs. And I see overall in the regulation and other contexts references to automated decisions. But I want to tell you it is, or negative, or no, it's like for education, impact on access to education. But it's often not about decisions about access, it's about negative impacts as to access to jobs. And before you even learn of a job, that can be if advertising is steered in a certain way, if search is done in a certain way, you do not even learn of an open position. Hiring tools rarely make affirmative hiring decisions, but they automate rejections. So you really need to think not in automated decisions, but in negative impacts on availability of access to certain situations. Education is limited where used for determining access. Do you see that that is not the right phrase? Okay, under-regulates. The regulation focuses on education work and government, and then on specifically on credit risk scoring. But my take always is, if you think about it, and I'm a professor in data protection, etc., and new technologies, you need there's about 7 categories where people access is really important to lead a proper autonomous life. If you are discriminated in those areas, it's very hard to live your life in a proper way. And what are they? Indeed, education, indeed, work. But health services, not when AI is implemented in a device, but any access to lifestyle programs, etc., is very, if you don't have that because you're discriminated, that is an issue. Financial services, not only credit risk scoring, but all types of financial services, loans, but health, again, insurance, etc. Government is government services, true, aid and unemployment aid, etc. But these days also telco and internet access. Without that, people feel it's very hard to live a proper life. And travel and access to other countries, also very important. So if you regulate social scoring only for governments, but not for the list of services I think are critical for a proper life, trustworthiness scoring for renting a bike, social media, loyalty scoring, lifestyle scores for health insurance, I think we're missing the boat in the new world. So the next point, lessons learned from GDPR. I see a lot of ex-ante administrative requirements, like a register for processing, a register for AI, high-risk AI. And I remember before GDPR, we thought it was a good idea to have a register for data processing activities because they were limited. My prediction is that within soon, there's so many high-risk AI systems that any register will be pointless and just add red tape without having any added value. Here I see a mix of ex-ante and accountability. GDPR is full accountability, and I think we should go that way for this as well. For instance, I listed CE marking for AI developed in-house, like big companies like Wouter Bos is working for, and deployed only internally. I mean, what is the use of a CE marking? That is from a product liability perspective, etc. I think my advice would be to really make a separate regime for that and do not consider everything workable from a more product liability perspective. Then the last point is, yeah, I'm rounding up, it's the competitive advantage. And I want to, the sandbox environment will not be enough. Maybe we should say sandboxes are for EU companies, startup, it should be combined with innovation hubs, the skills to do privacy by design, security and ethics by design, to train algorithms to get bias out, that those skills are so scarce at the moment that and those who have them are very expensive. And I think if we don't help them in that respect and making that available, we will lose out in the competition angle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Loka, and indeed really good to hear the let's say independent academic perspective here, which is very valuable. Now, before we head to back to the rest of the panel, I want to double check. I see Kilian Gross is still on line. Kilian, I would love to hear your response to a few of the things mentioned. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
But there have been lots of things. So if I reply to everything, I think you will have a huge problem with your timeline.
No, indeed. And I think first of all, I think there was a lot of compliments in the direction of the Commission for, first of all, having having presented this proposal, and second of all, for the inclusive way of getting to this point where we are now. But then one of the things that we've heard is on that definition of high risk and the all-inclusive category versus much more narrow use. And I think this is something that you did allude to in your contribution already, but I would want to hear your response to that particular point first, and then maybe, you know, if something else stood out for you, feel free to also include that in the first response.
Okay, I don't want to take too much time because I'm of course passionate about this topic, and I can, if I have to listen to you, I like of course the nice words you say, but for all the criticism, of course, I would like to reply, but that's natural. On the definition, I think you need to read it together, because we have the OECD definition, which I think is the only definition where we have some international recognition. We were thinking about taking the high-level expert group definition or the OECD definition. In reality, if you look at these definitions, they're all rather broad. And this is for a good reason, because AI is not one technology or one technique. There's a family of technologies, and this is developing, and nobody is really able to say what will be considered AI in 2, 3, 5 years down the line from now. So there are some common features. That's why we put them together in one group of technologies, but it's not really possible to say this is AI and this is completely exclusive will be AI. So we think to have not just a risk-based approach, and there we tried really to be different than the GDPR, to be more concrete and to learn a bit the lessons, because there are some implementation difficulties. We tried really to give requirements, and not just to say, okay, when it's risky, we treat it as AI. I exaggerate a bit. That would be the other alternative, to say when an ADM system displays certain risk features, then let's treat it as AI, because these risk features are similar to AI. We didn't want to go that way, because we think that would really put all the burden on the user or the provider, and you would be left alone with a very complex decision. So we tried as a legislator to make life for the operators as simple as possible by being specific. And that we achieved here, I think, with the Annex. So we tried to give a definition which sets the boundaries. So Patrick is right. We have future developments, but we have outer boundaries. The definition of the OECD will not be changed without a legislative modification. This is our marge de maneuver, so to say. Within that, we specify further the techniques used in Annex 1. And this should help you. So if you want to see whether you are in or out, you need to read the definition plus Annex 1, which gives you specific details on the technique. And that should really facilitate your life. What we can update, and there's always, and that's the same as like for the other delegated acts, therefore there is not an unlimited marge de maneuver for the sub-delegated legislator, which I think is completely correct, because this is for Parliament and Council to decide, not for an administrative body in the end, is to say, okay, are there now other techniques which fulfill the definition of the OECD, which we should list in Annex 1 in order to make it easier. So that is a bit the attempt. It's not an endless opening to say which kind of future we look at. We have boundaries. We have a definition from the OECD, but we go an extra mile in order to make this more operational and easier. That is the Annex, where we are very detailed and limited in our Annex. And as a counterpart, we say, but if there are in 3 years from now different recipes to develop this kind of technology, we want to have the opportunity to amend or complement this list of techniques. So that is a bit the technique which we have chosen. I think that is rather clear. And obviously, that's another point which comes with the Delegated Act. This is, as a lawyer, a challenge, because we regulate something which is very fast moving. We try to jump on a car which is on full speed, and we try to get it right without using open legal concepts. And therefore, we use this delegated technique in order to have this openness for the future, which I think is useful because it provides for the user clarity, and it puts the burden to update it on the legislator and not the full burden always on the operator to say, well, you have to look what happens, and we just give you abstract criteria. But of course, we will respect legal certainty. When you see the application of the regulation, we always say it will only apply for those systems which are on the market or in use when the transitional period is over. And the same will apply for delegated acts. It will never be retroactive. You will not have to fear my system is now on the market and now I have to readapt or something. We will always provide this kind of transitional period, because we know, of course, that you cannot retroactively change this, and you need some kind of preparation time in order to be able to adapt yourself. But so we think we really gave it a lot of thought because we understand that in particular, and I'm grateful for the remark of Locke, that of course it's tricky for small companies and startups, which are our innovation drivers in Europe. We have a different landscape, let's be honest, in the US. We don't have the GAFAs. We have a lot of small and medium-sized companies who are very innovative, and we should not deter them from using AI. And that's why we think we need to make it as simple as is possible in such a complex technology, and these annexes are a way to make it simple so that you don't need an AI counselor or a law firm in order to undertake the endeavor to develop some AI. And in particular, that's the other side. We want to increase the uptake of AI. And therefore, we think if it's then trustworthy and certified, it should as well as the other side of the coin, that European undertakings use AI. And here, this is the other side as well on the recruitment discussion, because if I'm afraid as a company that if I use AI afterwards, I may have a reputational risk because people may complain, they may go to equality bodies or to courts, and I'm then accused of being discriminatory, I will be very careful. The CE label here and the test as well allows you to say, I have done my duty. I have bought something which was testified, which was checked, which is compliant. I follow the instructions, that's what I'm supposed to do. And now this will have an impact on my liability and as well on my reputation. I don't need to be scared to use this AI. I think that is as well something we need to take into account why companies don't use AI in sensitive areas, because of course they are scared of financial or reputational risks that afterwards they may be in trouble because they may not be able to defend themselves efficiently. On recruitment, yes, you can, of course, discuss the use cases. This is the very core of the regulation because the interplay of the definition of AI and the use case defines really where the regulation kicks in. And then it's when it becomes, of course, a bit tougher. You can discuss this, whether they are too wide or too narrow. It is a bit tricky because, as well, what we saw here in the very interesting presentation, by the way, from Randstad, from the colleague, this is excellent what they do. And we like that. And we like to use AI. But if this is done incorrectly, for instance, or it does not work, or information, the system is not robust or accurate, it can lead to problems. So we need to, what we ask for, and that's what we try to explain, is what we do is, I think, a bit different than GDPR. We really try to use a product-based approach. We look at what we can really do well, and this is, I think, where we have a success in the internal market on product legislation, where we have a really good internal market, and we use this new legislative framework approach. We take AI as a product, and when products are a bit risky, even toys, we make sure that they are fine by checking them ex ante and then allowing a full use on the market. And that's the same what we try to do here. Sometimes I think perhaps one mistake we have done is that we call them high risk. It looks like they're very dangerous, or perhaps better don't use them, or only use them when you're really an expert in using them. This is a bit perhaps sometimes misleading. The only thing we ask you to do is, this is a product which may, in certain circumstances, cause damage. A doll is not high risk, but nevertheless, there is a sectorial legislation for dolls because children are particularly vulnerable. It is just to make sure that the products we have on our market are fine, that they're robust, that they're accurate, that there's sufficient documentation. It should not be a miracle, that should not be excessive, but you should be, as a consumer, be on the safe side if you use that kind of product. That's what we want to make sure. We want to increase the uptake. We don't want to deter that you feel, okay, oh, this is high risk, better don't do it because I'm not an expert on AI. So I now could, of course, continue. So perhaps just on the GDPR, we think, yes, of course, there are interlinks, but I would be a bit prudent to say now, we do the second side of the GDPR story. The GDPR is on data, and now we do what some people call the GDPR for algorithm. I think we should do it a bit differently. GDPR has its own right. It's very important. It's, I think, a benchmark globally. It's a full system with the law enforcement directive and the Acts for the European Union. But what we do is now we look at users, not really at the technology. We look at users of a given technology. And we try, I think, to follow a bit the modern approach to take software as a product and to create product-related legislation, to look at really the dedicated problems of this product. That's why we, for instance, we don't really propose additional redress mechanism, because we don't think we need a whole system of legal remedies on AI. We just need to make sure that if AI is used, the people concerned have the same legal remedies as they would have in the analog world, so that the bodies checking have enough information, have enough documentation, can do their job. That's a bit how we see this. That's why I think, of course, we complement the system, but I think we use a bit of a different approach. Perhaps I'll stop here because otherwise I eat up the time of all the others. But thanks for letting me.
Thank you so much. And indeed, I want to ask each of the panelists for a quick response to this, but also maybe starting with you, Patrick. One of the elements we haven't touched upon so much yet is the topic of AI oversight mechanisms. What do you, what do you think is needed from the Commission, from Parliament, from member states to ensure that there is access to sufficient AI talent in that aspect?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, at the moment, you can hear me. Yeah. At the moment in Europe, there's roughly about 40% of us with digital skills, and there's about a 90% requirement of those digital skills by 2025. So there's clearly a gap that needs to be filled. Industry will obviously play a role in that through upskilling and trying to enable people to move into these new jobs that are going to be created by new technologies and the digital revolution in general. In terms of what the Commission can do here, obviously in terms of education, it's sort of a limited role they play, but coordination and encouragement for the member states to take this seriously is definitely something that's welcome. Of course, we also need correct frameworks as well. And I would just like to hit home the point again that we're making about the use of AI in employment and how Annex 3 is written at the moment. We believe it's seriously going to hamper the use of AI in the employment situation. So not just the part about recruitment, but really about the development of innovative AI solutions and using them in the workplace. Because if we look at, the ability to make delegated acts on the basis of potentially encroaching on fundamental rights, and also applying that into Annex 3, where we speak about things like, management of workers and how they, spend time on their tasks and things like this. Nothing to do with, if they're dismissed or hired or anything really about bias there. We're kind of worried that these heavy requirements are going to be placed on them. And, this is a concern because AI can support human resources. It can support people's own career development, help managers to manage better, enhance training and coaching for individuals as well. So, a lot of these things are, commonplace practices already for human resources and employment management in general. So we're a little bit worried about the impact there and what that could do for development of AI in the workplace and labour markets in general.
No, that's a very clear point, and indeed important to underline that once again. I see that Mr. Gross has to leave, but thanks very much, Kilian, for joining us and for coming back to address the panel. Thanks very much for that. Wouter Bas, we've already heard Lokke make the point about SMEs versus large companies, and I think that's also something that Kilian mentioned. As chair of the WEC Europe Task Force, our industry, of course, also represents or includes a lot of SMEs. Do you believe this proposal does offer support to them to adopt AI in their business, as Kilian Gross claimed?
Yeah. So indeed, the industry, we have large and we have small players. Like I said before, I personally work at one of the large players, but we also represent the small players in the context of the WEC. And I think that what you see is that the framework introduces elements that are very much adopted with many large recruitment firms. They have already compliance departments. They are able to work with frameworks to secure data quality, to ensure system security, human oversight, transparency, and all those kind of things when they develop AI. They have big IT departments, knowledgeable teams. I think where we see the risk is for the smaller players, because they don't have that kind of capabilities in their and skills and capacity in their organizations, and they actually have to rely even more on the large tech suppliers, which we know, and that relates also to what Lokke said before and on her learnings from GDPR, that we see that most large tech suppliers are actually not in Europe, but are outside of Europe. And for me and for the WEC, that's really a concern, because potentially that means that all the innovation is actually more and more still going to be with the very large tech players, and that will actually make the reliance of European small and mid-size entities in recruitment and staffing, and more relying on large US or Chinese players, and actually also from a GDPR put the risk more there to have that data processed by these kind of companies, rather than innovating in our own space and having the smaller entities coming up with proper innovations there. And yeah, I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And I think what Locke was saying there makes some sense. Think about like sandboxing and knowledge available to European entities to help support it, and also really think about where do you want to put the focus on from a CE markation perspective. Do you want to have everything in our industry being managed by this, or do you want to put the focus on anything that has a negative impact? And I think that's something that would be helpful to address that more specifically.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. Locke, I want to move to you, and I have a question for you, but I also want to ask you, keeping an eye on the time, to after answering the question, to wrap up with a two-sentence closing statement, and I'll also ask Patrick and Walter Bas to do the same after you. And my question to you is actually, and this is something you alluded to a little bit in your introduction, is about let's say, the global perspective. How does the European proposal compare to the situation in other regions, and also how might it impact the situation in those other regions, like in the GDPR?
Yeah, well, as Killian said, we have the precautionary principle. We try to prevent damage before it actually occurs. And the US, for instance, has a totally different system. They are harms-based, meaning that they wait till harm really presents itself and then they intervene where there is specific harm. I'm a European at the core, so I will always thought that we had the better system, like a nice and European. But I've seen that the harms-based approach can be very effective because you really intervene where it is relevant. And so, for instance, we see the first state laws popping up, drafts for use of AI tooling in the recruitment sector, and then really targeted at what it should be, which is easier to do than having an omnibus law trying to regulate all AI and having under and over regulation. And look, I think it is good to send a signal that, you know, AI is not free for all, and that there are limits on where there's a negative impact on society. So I would be very much in favor to do it on a risk-based, but then also try to focus on where it does actually harm. Also to keep a level playing field with the US. So, because don't forget, the first legal actions, in a way they are not regulating, but, you know, employment discrimination also in the recruitment context violates US employment discrimination laws. And I tell you, the first actions are filed. The FTC is investigating certain AI recruitment tooling. So in a way, we are talking about precautionary legislation and they are already enforcing. So, and the fact is that ultimately we have a different system, but I see that at the end, when harm shows up, then we actually agree quite quickly on what the end result of both systems is quite similar. Where I'm worried is, and that's my last comment, a CE marking is valid if you are completely crystal clear on what the requirements are. But I tell you, having worked in these projects, we have continuous innovation on basic requirements on the GDPR already, like transparency, how to ensure explainability, how to get bias out of a tool. Even if you had proper data and cleaned it up, you need to check at the end and try to mitigate it with adversarial training, with all types of measures. I'm worried. I've seen that if you give a stamp to something which is outdated 2 weeks later, and I've worked on projects where innovations were going so fast that halfway down, you know, it wasn't good enough, well, the starting point we had, that you actually allow what I call a petrification of all technology that is not there yet. That's the good thing about GDPR. It always needs to be state of the art, which is a nuisance as well. But if you start putting a stamp on things that are, and somebody else improves, you would want to. So that's why I think a CE marking, we could do that in a trial period of 3 years to try to learn what the requirements should be, like provisionary CE, you know, rather than trying to fit it in a product liability system while the technology is not there yet. It's just not there yet. And I can go left and right. We are not there yet with AI. It is the first car, I always say, without brakes or without proper brakes. It's just in its infancy. So
yes.
that is for me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Loka. And gentlemen, who might I give the floor for a quick closing comment first? Any volunteers? Otherwise, yeah, Patrick, go ahead.
I don't want to take it away from the chair here of the committee.
Go ahead, Patrick. Go ahead, Patrick. I feel totally comfortable with that.
Yeah. So no. Final thing to say. I mean, just off what Loka said about you know, how regulation or not regulation, just the general policy approach around the rest of the world is compared to Europe. I mean, yeah, the US takes a wait and see approach, right? It promotes innovation and it acts when it sees problems. Europe has always taken this approach of, you know, we have this crystal ball and we're trying to guess in the future what the societal concerns are. That might be reasonable if we're thinking 5 years ahead, but it's not reasonable if we're thinking 20 years ahead. So I think we need to be careful about that. And also, you know, as well, people are saying that, yes, this is the first AI regulation in the world. We have a lot of regulation already that applies to AI technologies, you know, liability, privacy, cybersecurity laws. We're about to have laws on data sharing as well, competition policy. So there's a lot there already. So we really, I think Europe, while trying to take this precautionary approach and thinking maybe 5 years ahead, should also understand the things that we actually already have in place. As well when we're making those decisions. And then of course, you know, that's even more important when you're thinking about China with its top-down planned economy and the fact that they've got all the data, they've got all the money. We'll see if Europe's approach to trust will stand the test of time. Obviously, we hope it does. I think business shares the exact same values as citizens and as workers in terms of, you know, AI technology in general. And so I think, you know, we could get there, but, you know, let's not use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. That would be the kind of thing I would say. Thanks.
Excellent point indeed. Wouter Bos, famous last words.
Yeah, I think a lot of things have been said, so I will not repeat it. I think in general, my perception is I think it's a great initiative and it's good that we as Europe try to take the lead. I think a risk-based approach totally makes sense, and the controls for high-risk AI make also total sense, also talking from practice there. I think where the risk is, this is innovation, and indeed CE marcation with unclear requirements might not help in what we try to achieve here. And I think a concept like accountability makes more sense there, and also more clarity on how that risk-based approach is to be applied, also considering that we don't want to kill innovation. So we really need to find more balance there rather than putting a full industry blanket over the use of technology within that industry.
Absolutely. And speaking of innovation, that actually brings me to the next point on the agenda, but not before I thank each of you once again very much for your contribution to the panel. And that brings me to what is actually almost the final part of our program today. Tina Keshap, she's a product manager for intelligent applications at Kelly Services, And Tina will share with us another best practice or another case study of how AI is actually being used in recruitment practices. Tina, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you for having me, Menno. It's been wonderful. So my name is Tina Kashyap, Intelligent Applications Product Manager at Kelly, and I am based out of US. So we at Kelly actually understand that technology is going to disrupt and reshape the labor market. So therefore, we are continuing to evaluate emerging technologies because they are benefiting the user experience for our clients, for our suppliers, and for our talent. So today, I'll be talking about our innovation journey because we believe in, we believe in engaging with our talent in their space. And we do employ a talent first mentality because we are always thinking about what's next for our talent. We act with urgency and agility, and we believe in coloring outside the lines. And what I meant by that is we are always willing to take that bold and innovative and creative ideas at all levels in our organization. So what we did is a couple of years back, we established an innovation team at Kelly, and that has led the way in defining technologies and processes to improve our frontline productivity, and it enriches our talent experience as well. So this team has helped in embracing future ways of working to improve our business and our client experiences. So we heard from everybody that how we can ensure that innovation is taking place in the organization, and what Waterbass said, that we cannot just have innovation taking place in the larger organizations. It has to be for everybody. So what we do here is when we are procuring or we are onboarding any new software, we follow a technology assessment process, even if we are doing a proof of concept or a pilot, because we understand that if this pilot is going to be successful, we will be expanding the services into our broader technology ecosystem. And this technology assessment process actually allows us to assess the level of risk a technology may pose to our business. And I would say it's a pretty comprehensive document that we have. And the question varies anywhere from infrastructure, like, where the tech is going to be hosted. Is it going to be on-prem, or is it going to be on cloud? Questions around information security, like, how encryption is going to work. Questions around compliance, like, data privacy laws across the globe. Is this tech going to save candidates' PII information? And, as the technology partners that we work with, they started talking about more and more of, artificial intelligence. What we did is we introduced a couple of questions related to artificial intelligence in that tech assessment document. And those questions are around, how do vendors train AI? What kind of data, what kind of logic, what kind of processes they use to eliminate that statistical and machine learning pitfalls that they have. Do they think that their system is at risk of bias? And what kind of actions they are taking to ensure the system removes that bias, or that risk of discrimination on the basis of, can be racial, can be ethnic origin, or sometimes sexual orientation. And that list goes on. And we also are using a lot of chatbots at Kelly, and we consider them as part of our family. So we started our digital journey by building chatbots, and these 3 chatbots are something that we build over a period of time. Ava is our internal chatbot. It's sitting in Microsoft Teams. It can talk about, HR policies, HR benefits, and a couple of technology questions that folks have inside Kelly. And then we do have another chatbot, which is Kelly Chatbot. It is an external chatbot. It's for our talent, and it's sitting on Facebook, and it's sitting on our career webpage. And what it does is it helps the candidates search for jobs, or if they have any questions about Kelly, they can always reach out to Kelly chatbot. And then we do have another chatbot, this Kai, which is for our supplier folks, and it answers their questions. So this is the case study that I'm going to be focusing on. Today's talent wants 24/7 access because we are living in this world of instant gratification. So what happens is candidate comes to our career website and they apply there, and then there is our pre-screening chatbot, Maya, sitting there, and it asks those knockout questions, and those knockout questions have been defined by our recruiters when they have received the job description from our client. And those questions, as Glenn covered earlier, those questions are around, are you 18 years or above? If that job requires you to drive, do you have a valid driver's license? And then the statuses get captured in our applicant system. And eventually the candidates who qualify for that particular job, they automatically get on our recruiter's calendar. And what is happening here is there's a human intervention all the time because our recruiters are reading the responses that candidates are providing to us. And in that matter, what happens is once the candidates have been shortlisted, our recruiters get in touch with them and they have a very meaningful conversation with them. And they actually try to understand what the candidate is looking for. And then it basically creates that warm connect between recruiter and the candidate. And then that really helps us in redeploying that candidate because our recruiter already knows what this candidate is looking for in the job market. And then another feature that we utilize from this product is called outreach. So what happens is there are tons of candidates who are applying for jobs. They are getting captured in our applicant tracking system, and those become our passive candidates. So what this product does, Maya, is it basically, whenever a new job is posted, it looks into the database and it sees that, do I have the relevant candidates available that I can reach out to? And it starts the outreaching. And in this next slide, you can see that this is what our candidates have shared with us. These are a couple of testimonials. They really, really like engaging with the technology because imagine somebody looking for a job at 10 in the night and there is a pre-screening chatbot sitting on the website. They will be able to access to that. And if they are shortlisted, the recruiter can talk to them like the very next morning. And they have been we have received some amazing positive responses from our candidates when we have used this technology. And thank you. So over to you, Menno, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Tina. And once again, a brilliant example of the wonders of technology and of how AI can be used and is being used on a day-to-day basis already in our industry in a, I would say, low-risk manner. Now, the only thing left for me to do is now actually to wrap up by looking at the time here. I think we've learned a lot today. I certainly have. And maybe the first thing that I've learned is that technology and AI, as Patrick said, are growth enablers. And as such, I think we've been able to illustrate how AI can play an important role in improving the recruitment experience for job seekers, making fair hiring decisions, and in short, create more inclusive and efficient labor markets. However, we also know, based on today's discussion, that European people and businesses will need a framework that spurs innovation. We know that AI comes with certain risks involved, and so we must ensure that AI is and remains human-centered. And I think, you know, it's good to see that we now have a proposal for a regulatory framework that will set the perimeters for trustworthy AI. Trustworthiness, of course, is one of the keywords in the Commission's approach to the topic of AI. And I think in many of Kilian Gross's comments, even when he didn't use the word trustworthiness, a lot of it comes back to trustworthy AI, whether it's about being trustworthy towards job seekers and individuals, but also providing trustworthiness and trust for the companies using it, and trying to make sure that we all know the regulation that we face, and that we actually feel empowered to start using AI rather than being afraid to face uncertain risks. And I think one thing that I would highlight as we stand here in May of 2021, with at the beginning, I would say, of a legislative process where the European Council and the European Parliament will both discuss this topic, that WEC Europe, as well as the entire employment and recruitment industry, look forward and stand ready to continue the discussion on this topic, both with these institutional stakeholders, but also with our fellow social partners, in order to really achieve a situation where we can create fair and equitable labor markets for all. Again, thank you to all the speakers who joined us. Also, thank you to each of you for joining us in the audience today. The colleagues from the World Employment Confederation are putting some links in the chat where you can find more resources about the WEC Europe position on AI, and as well as on WEC Europe more in general. Having said all that, it's been a pleasure to have you all, and with that we close this webinar. Thank you very much.